Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the dim, candlelit chambers of a woman whose face might look ethereal in portraits, but whose morning routine could make your skin tingle in all the wrong ways. You're here with Elizabeth I, yes, the Virgin Queen herself, sitting before her mirror as she prepares for the day. The scent of beeswax candles and a faint metallic tang hangs in the air. You probably won't survive this without feeling at least one sympathetic itch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. I always love seeing our little global map of night owls. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge over the creaking wooden floor, careful not to scuff the delicate rug imported from the Ottoman Empire. Elizabeth sits upright in a carved oak chair, posture perfect, perhaps the only perfectly hygienic thing in this room. On the dressing table before her lies an array of powders and brushes, but nothing resembling what you would call skin care today. There's a small bowl of water, lukewarm, murky, and clearly not meant for much more than wetting a cloth. She reaches for a pot of Venetian ceruse, the famous white lead face paint of the Elizabethan court. This is not a dainty dusting. It's a thick, ghostly mask, smoothed onto the skin with the confidence of someone who's done it every day for years. Historians still argue whether she adopted the look purely for fashion or partly to hide scars from a bout of smallpox in 1562. Either way, the lead-based concoction works slowly and mercilessly, drying the skin, creating sores, and ironically making her need to apply even more to mask the damage. You lean closer, watching the faint shimmer of lead dust in the sunlight. A thin puff escapes as the brush sweeps across her forehead, and you instinctively hold your breath. You can practically feel your own pores protesting. Somewhere in the background, a lady-in-waiting adjusts the queen's ruff, an elaborate collar that in this heat must feel like wearing a tablecloth starched with sand, washing it all off. That's not really in the plan. Elizabeth, like many in her era, believes that frequent bathing might open the body to illness. Instead, she'll wash by gently rubbing her face with a linen cloth dampened in rosewater or sometimes wine. And when the lead paint builds up too much, her attendants resort to scraping it away with small sticks, as if peeling a very delicate wall. It's as unsettling as it sounds, but she does have a few tricks for freshness. A dab of crushed orris root, perhaps, for a floral scent. A nibble of candied fennel seeds to sweeten the breath briefly. You notice that her teeth are not quite the pearly white of modern toothpaste ads. In fact, the sugar-heavy diet of the Tudor elite is quietly working against her. And here's the thing, portraits tell only half the story. They freeze her in a moment of regal perfection, untouched by the smell of metal, unbothered by the stiffness of painted skin. But if you stayed in this room longer, past the polite curtsies and diplomatic chatter, you'd realize the air grows heavier. Your eyes sting a little, and you're starting to wonder if your own pillow might retain the smell of lead after tonight's journey. Still, she wears it all with grace, the way only a monarch who controls her image so fiercely can. And as she stands to leave for the day, the light catches the powder just so, transforming what you know to be toxic into something almost celestial. Almost. You glide now from England's drafty palaces to the perfumed corridors of Versailles, where the air itself seems to sparkle with gossip and powder. Marie Antoinette is holding court, not in the political sense, but in the grand theater of appearance. You find yourself near the towering form of her hair, which, even at a cautious distance, feels like it deserves its own postal code. The room smells faintly of orange blossom, beeswax, and something more alive. You soon realize the alive part is not a metaphor. The Queen's elaborate poof, her signature hair construction, can rise nearly 3 feet above her head, built from pads, wire frames, curls, and powdered flour. To maintain such a marvel of engineering, it's styled not daily, but sometimes only every few weeks. In between, she sleeps sitting up, head tilted like a vase of fragile flowers, while her attendants swaddle the whole contraption in linen to protect it from dust, or worse. And worse does come. Lice, those opportunistic tenants of history, find the royal boudoir just as appealing as any medieval peasant's thatch. Historians still argue whether the infestation stories are exaggerated, but you watch as a lady-in-waiting discreetly scratches the Queen's temple with the end of a long, fine comb. The motion is graceful, almost like tuning a delicate instrument, but you know exactly what it means. When the time comes for a fresh style, it's a full-day event. You sit through hours of brushing, teasing, and powdering. White flour, yes, baking flour sifts down into the air, coating your sleeves and clinging to your hair like snow. The flour helps stiffen the style and keep oils at bay, though the irony is not lost on you. While bread riots rage outside, the court literally wears food as a fashion accessory. And the additions. Tonight's chosen decoration is a miniature frigate, yes, an actual model of a sailing ship nestled proudly among the curls. Last week, it was a tableau of tiny silk vegetables. The week before, a stuffed bird. Each piece is anchored into the poof with such precision that you almost forget it's sitting on a human head. The maintenance. No shampoo as you know it. Instead, attendants sprinkle scented powders, lavender, orange peel, sometimes crushed iris root to mask any sourness that might emerge after a fortnight or two. But the scent can't hide everything. As the warmth of candles builds in the room, you catch the faint, musty tang of human scalp beneath all that grandeur. A small glass of milk and honey rests on the Queen's vanity, not for drinking, but for dabbing onto her skin as a moisturizer. You watch her pat it on, the sweetness mixing with the flour drifting from her hair. The combination, you realize, is probably as appealing to insects as it is to poets. There's a kind of magic here, though. and she sweeps into the mirrored hall, head glinting with powdered light. No one dares think of lice or sweat. The illusions are so strong that even you start to forget, until the ship in her hair shifts slightly, and you remember there's a living scalp holding up the harbor. You follow her through the salon, the poof swaying gently, the floor creaking under silk shoes. Outside, Paris simmers with discontent, but in here, all is frozen in courtly splendor and carefully masked realities. And you, still dusted with flour, realize that if you ever leaned your head back in this world, you might never get the powder out. You step softly now into the dim, perfumed corridors of the French court once again, though a generation before Marie Antoinette's high ships of hair. Catherine de Medici glides ahead of you, skirts whispering against the polished floor, a faint mist trailing in her wake. You expect perhaps a bath scene, or at least a jug of warm water at the ready, but you soon realize Catherine's version of cleanliness is something entirely different, something you can't quite wash off. She pauses near a carved cabinet, and from within emerges her arsenal. Crystal bottles of every size, each filled with liquid the color of autumn honey or pale spring rain. Perfume, gallons of it. For Catherine, bathing is less about water and more about artistry, layering scent upon scent until the skin itself becomes a bouquet. Historians still argue whether her aversion to bathing came from fear of illness or simply from habit formed in a time when hot water was more suspicious than comforting. A lady in waiting approaches with a cloth. Instead of wiping down the queen's arms with soap and water, she dabs at the skin with rosewater, then fans it dry. Over that goes the first mist of perfume, a blend of bergamot and ambergris, with a faint animalic undertone that clings to the air long after you've stepped back. It's strangely beautiful and faintly unsettling, like a love letter sealed with candle wax and kept too close to the fire. Catherine is said to have been one of the first to popularize scented gloves in France. You watch her slip on a pair of soft leather, already soaked in a heady mix of jasmine, clove, and civet. The heat of her hands awakens the oils, and the scent begins to bloom, drifting toward you in slow, steady waves. It's intoxicating enough to make you forget you're standing in a room with no open windows, breathing in the mingled ghosts of dozens of other perfumes layered over the years. But perfumes are not her only fragrant trick. From her belt hangs a small pomander, a hollow sphere of gold filigree, pierced with tiny openings. Inside, a paste of herbs, musk, and sometimes powdered pearls. She lifts it now and then to her nose as she walks, inhaling sharply. You can imagine why Versailles corridors and banquet halls aren't known for their fresh breeze. Behind the gilded facades, chamber pots are emptied into courtyards, meat roasts over smoky fires, and silk gowns trap every scent of the day. One of the stranger whispers you've heard about Catherine involves her alleged fascination with the medicinal uses of perfume, not just to mask odor, but to ward off sickness itself. The logic follows the miasma theory of her time. Sweet smells protect you from disease-laden bad air. whether she truly believed it or not. The result is the same by the time she sweeps past. The perfume cloud is so dense you could almost spread it with a knife. Yet even in this sea of scent, there's an odd warmth to her presence. The way she turns her head toward each person she passes, the quiet smile, the faint rustle of skirts, it's easy to see how the illusion works. Your nose may tell you she hasn't bathed in weeks, but your mind is busy calculating which of these scents might follow you into sleep tonight. And as the last trail of ambergris fades into the corridor, you realize you've been holding your breath just a little, like someone standing too close to a florist's shop in full bloom. You let it out slowly, feeling the ghost of her perfume still curling in your hair. You move now through the drafty stone halls of Tudor England again, though not into the presence of the reigning queen. Instead, you find yourself in the smaller, more intimate chambers of Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling favorite of Henry VI, now immortalized in both scandal and song. She sits near a narrow window, the weak winter light falling across her face. You notice at once that her smile is careful, almost calculated, as though she knows too much about how it appears to others. The truth is, that smile conceals a secret one shared by many of her time. Dental hygiene, such as it existed in the early 16th century, was more an occasional gesture than a daily ritual. In the basket beside her, you spot a slender, bristled stick, more twig than toothbrush, worn soft at the ends. Sometimes it's dipped in a paste of crushed cloves and honey, sometimes in powdered charcoal. Historians still argue whether she actually brushed her teeth with any regularity, or relied more on these aromatic chews to freshen her breath. Anne picks up a small silver case and tips a few whole cloves into her palm. She chews them slowly, releasing a spicy sweet scent that briefly fills the room. It's pleasant, almost festive, though you realize it's masking something deeper, the lingering sourness of wine, the faint shadow of last night's roasted meats. No minty toothpaste here, breath freshening, is a battle of spice versus time. On the table is a cup of warm wine mixed with rosemary water, what passes for a kind of mouth rinse. She swishes delicately, spits into a basin, and smiles again. This time, you notice the subtle unevenness of her teeth, a reminder that even a queen's consort is subject to the same slow creep of decay as her subjects. There's also a small jar of tooth powder nearby. You lean in and catch a whiff of burnt salt and crushed eggshell, a gritty mixture that works more like sandpaper than polish. The process is effective in scraping away residue, but harsh enough to wear the enamel over time. Imagine buffing a pearl with gravel. It will shine, yes, but not forever. And yet, despite the limitations, Anne's teeth are still considered good by Tudor standards. In a time when sugar was an expensive luxury, her diet is rich enough to cause trouble, but not yet ruinous. You've heard the whispers Henry himself was not so fortunate in his later years, hiding blackened teeth behind a thick beard and pursed lips. As she speaks, her voice is warm and engaging, kind that draws people in. You can almost see how such charm might sway a king to break with the Pope. But you can also imagine the quieter moments when the cloves have lost their flavor, the wine rinse has faded, and she sits by this window alone, the cold air seeping in, her smile relaxing into something more human. Somewhere in the hall, a servant passes carrying fresh rushes to scatter on the floor, their grassy scent briefly mingling with the cloves. The combination is oddly comforting, like two halves of a memory that don't quite match. You watch as Anne leans over her writing desk, the cloves now gone, her teeth just barely catching the light. The moment feels still, almost timeless, until you remember that this quiet world is only a prelude to the storm that history has already written for her. And as you step back from the window, the faint spice of cloves follows you, curling through the cold air, a reminder that even the smallest acts of self-care can carry their own stories through the centuries. You cross now into the royal courts of late 15th century Spain, where the air feels heavier, almost dense with incense and wool. Isabella of Castile sits at the center of it all, a queen whose piety is legendary, but whose bathing habits, well, you might not want to lean in too close. She adjusts the edge of her veil, her fingers lingering for a moment on the crisp linen that seems to form a second skin around her. To Isabella, bathing in water is not just unnecessary, it is, in her mind, potentially dangerous. The thinking of her time, reinforced by certain religious advisors, warns that water can open the pores and allow disease to slip in. And so, she embraces an alternative, the linen bath. Rather than immersing herself in tubs of water, she simply changes into fresh linen garments, sometimes several times a day, believing that the clean fabric will draw away sweat and dirt from the body. Historians still argue whether she ever bathed in water at all after her marriage to Ferdinand. But most agree that her devotion to the linen-only method was sincere. You watch as two maids bustle about the room, one loosening the laces of her gown, the other unfolding a set of gleaming white chemises from a cedar chest. The scent of cedar is sharp and clean, masking the faint musk that lingers in the air. When the old linen is removed, it is not washed immediately. Instead, it's aired out on lines, sometimes sprinkled with crushed herbs, before being returned to the laundry later in the week. The queen's skin has a pale, matte finish, a result not of powders, but of this constant fabric contact. She occasionally rubs her arms and face with a cloth dipped in rosewater, a rare indulgence that feels almost ceremonial. The water is minimal, barely enough to dampen the linen, and quickly blotted away. You catch a whiff of the faint floral note, quickly overwhelmed by the richer, warmer scent of wool and incense drifting from the chamber's small altar. Her hair, hidden under layers of veiling, is combed dry, the natural oils left intact. To freshen it, the attendants may sprinkle a bit of orris root powder near the scalp, the pale dust puffing into the air with each stroke. There is no lather, no rinsing, only this quiet ritual of powder and comb, powder and comb. And yet, she is immaculate in her own way. The folds of her gown are smooth, the lacework on her cuffs pristine. To the court, she appears every inch the virtuous monarch, untouched by the common grime of life. If you didn't know the absence of water in her daily routine, you might believe she was the very embodiment of purity. But as you linger in the room, you realize that cleanliness is, here, more about symbol than sensation. It's about the image of constant renewal, even if the skin beneath has not felt a true bath in years. The queen rises, her new linen whispering against her skin, and moves toward the chapel. Her steps are slow and deliberate, and you fall into step behind her, catching the faint mingling of cedar, rose, and something more human, something the linen alone cannot quite erase. And as the chapel doors close, the sound of fabric on fabric seems to echo, like waves that will never quite reach the shore. You find yourself now in the ornate, slightly shadowed chambers of Renaissance Italy, trailing behind Lucrezia Borgia. The daughter of Pope Alexander VI, she's a woman whose name history has tangled in scandal, whether all of it is deserved or not. Tonight, though the rumors are quiet, what strikes you most is the way the air seems almost tangible around her, thick with a scent you can't quite place at first. It's her gloves. Lucrezia slips them off as she settles at a long table, the leather catching the candlelight with a faint sheen. At first glance, they look ordinary, supple, cream-colored, the kind any well-bred noblewoman might wear. But as they land on the table beside her plate, the scent blooms outward in waves. Rich musk, violet, and something darker, like spiced wine left too long in the sun. These are not simply gloves. They are small, wearable perfume vessels. In her era, scented gloves are a luxury, imported from Spain, and often soaked in elaborate concoctions of oils and essences. Historians still argue whether they began purely as fashion or as a way to disguise the less charming aromas of city life, especially in Rome, where even the grandest palaces are never entirely free from the whiff of refuse and animals. You watch as Lucrezia's fingers brush the gloves inside, where the perfume has saturated the leather. The oils leave a faint shimmer on her skin, clinging there long after the glove is gone. This, of course, means the scent doesn't just follow her. It lingers in every room she passes through, clinging to tapestries and wood like smoke. The fragrance is no accident. Recipes from the time often include civet or ambergris, animal-derived bases that fix the scent so it won't fade quickly mixed with rose, orange blossom, or clove. The result is an aroma that feels almost alive, shifting as the wearer moves. And it's not just for social occasions. On hot summer days, when sweat darkens the fine linen under her gown, the gloves mask the reality without a single drop of water touching her skin. She picks at a platter of roasted quail, the rich meat and spiced sauce adding their own notes to the air. Between bites, she occasionally presses the gloves back to her nose, almost absently, as if recharging her own senses. You realize that in a time before soap and deodorant as we know them, this isn't vanity, it's strategy. gloves are not without drawbacks. The oils seep into the skin over time, leaving a faint stickiness on her fingers. And the musk, powerful as it is, can easily overwhelm in close quarters. You catch a glimpse of one courtier leaning ever so slightly back as she gestures animatedly in conversation. But no one would dare complain. The scent is as much her signature as the jewels she wears. When she rises to leave, she tucks the gloves back onto her hands, the warmth releasing another rush of perfume. It's almost dizzying, and you realize you can no longer tell where the scent ends and the room begins. Even after she is gone, the air feels heavy, as if her presence is stitched into it. And as you follow that lingering trail into the corridor, you wonder if history remembers her for the wrong reasons, or if, perhaps, the stories about poison rings and intrigue are just another kind of perfume, masking the more ordinary truth that sometimes a woman simply wanted to smell better than the world around her. You step now into the mid-19th century, where the flicker of gaslight casts a golden haze over Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria sits in a high-backed chair, skirts spilling like a dark tide across the carpet, a porcelain tray of toiletries spread before her. The room is warm from the coal fire, but the air carries a strange tang, chalky, sharp, and faintly sweet. It comes from her toothbrush. Yes, Victoria owns toothbrushes, plural. Some carved from ivory, others from bone, their bristles made from boar hair. One lies in her hand now, the handle delicately curved, the bristles slightly frayed from use. She dips it into a small pot of toothpaste, though paste might be generous. The gritty mixture is made from chalk, cuttlefish bone powder, and occasionally soap. You imagine that brushing with it would feel less like polishing enamel and more like scrubbing it with beach sand. She applies it carefully, working in neat, circular motions, the way her dental surgeon advised. Historians still argue whether she truly followed these instructions daily or treated them as more of a polite suggestion. But she certainly took pride in her appearance, even if dentistry at the time was more art than science. When she spits into a delicate china basin, the mixture runs chalky white, the taste of soap lingering. To freshen her breath, she reaches for a small tin of lozenges, peppermint compressed with sugar, and lets one dissolve on her tongue. The sweetness is immediate, but you can tell it's fighting a losing battle against the dryness the chalk paste leaves behind. Dental care in her era is a curious mix of progress and holdover. Dentists now understand the importance of cleaning teeth, yet tooth decay remains common, and extractions are still a routine solution for pain. Even Victoria, with all her access to the best care money can buy, occasionally turns to clove oil to numb an aching molar. You notice a tiny vial of it among her toiletries, the cork stained from repeated use. There's something almost tender in the way she handles these objects, as if they're part of a private ritual rather than a medical necessity. And they are her mornings often begin with this quiet time, away from the public eye, before the day's endless audiences and ceremonies. But no matter how carefully she brushes, the limitations of the tools remain. Boar bristles are coarse, and toothpaste formulas vary wildly. Some contain burnt breadcrumbs, others a hint of ammonia. You can imagine the taste, metallic and dusty, lingering long after the brushing is done. Victoria's smile in portraits is modest, lips closed, teeth hidden. In person, her teeth are healthy enough, but not the gleaming white modern viewers expect. That ideal simply doesn't exist yet. Instead, clean means free from obvious debris, breath softened by peppermint, and no visible signs of rot. When she's finished, the toothbrush is rinsed in plain water, the bristles shaken dry. She sets it back in its case, the faint smell of soap and chalk hanging in the air. The tray is covered with a linen cloth, and just like that, the ritual is tucked away, invisible to the public, who will only ever see the polished surface of the Queen's image. You leave with the taste of that chalky paste lingering in your imagination, wondering whether it's better or worse than the cloven charcoal methods of the Tudors. The fire pops softly behind you, and the room grows still, save for the quiet, rhythmic tick of the clock counting down to the next public smile. You are far from gaslit parlors now, pacing behind a figure whose presence fills the dusty air of the 12th century. Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of both France and later England, moves briskly down a sun-baked road, her traveling cloak trailing behind. The year is hot, the road long, and the concept of personal hygiene is packed somewhere between the wine skins and the royal banners, which is to say, not close at hand. She is in motion constantly, from court to battlefield to pilgrimage route. Bathhouses exist in her time, especially in southern France, but Eleanor's itinerant lifestyle means weeks can pass without her stepping into one. Instead, she relies on the travel-friendly hygiene of her day. Linen shifts changed when possible, and scented pouches tucked discreetly among her belongings. One of her ladies rides just behind her, clutching a small satchel filled with dried lavender, rosemary, and crushed marjoram. Every so often, Eleanor pulls the pouch from her belt and presses it to her nose. The scent is strong and herbal, covering the musk of leather saddles and the faint animal smell of horses. Historians still argue whether she avoided bathing for practical reasons, time, safety, lack of facilities, or if she, like many of her peers, believed water could weaken the body. When the traveling party stops at a fortified town, Eleanor's attendants set to work freshening their mistress. They lay out a clean shift and a gown aired in the sun, and they use warm cloths to wipe her neck, arms, and face. The water is barely enough to dampen the skin, but the scented pouch makes the process feel almost luxurious. A small silver comb appears next, pulling through hair that's been confined under a veil for days. There's no soap, only the mechanical sweep of the teeth and the occasional sprinkle of powdered iris to absorb excess oil. At night, the scent pouches are tucked under her pillow, mingling with the faintly dusty smell of straw mattresses and wool blankets. The air in the tent is heavy with campfire smoke, which unintentionally masks human odors better than any perfume. Still, in the close quarters of travel, there's no hiding the reality. This is a body in constant motion, collecting the smells of the road like badges of honor. You catch glimpses of her other travel hacks. A lemon wedge, rare and precious, used to rub her hands after meals, cutting through the grease. A small bottle of rosewater splashed lightly on her veil before entering a hall, so that her arrival carries a note of freshness even after days on horseback. A sprig of mint chewed not just for the taste, but for the sense of renewal it brings in the middle of a long, dusty day. In the flickering firelight, Alina talks and laughs with her companions, seemingly unbothered by any discomfort. There's a resilience here, a confidence in being seen as she is, a queen who can ride hard, sleep rough, and still command the room at the next court she enters. As the camp quiets, the last smells of the day, smoke, leather, herbs, settle over you like a blanket. Somewhere outside, a horse stamps and shifts in the dark. Alina's scent pouch rests beside her head, the lavender faint now, the rosemary sharper. You breathe in and realize that for her, cleanliness isn't about perfection. It's about carrying a trace of the familiar through places that smell of everything but home. Steam curls into the air now, scented faintly of minerals and something vaguely sulfurous. You're standing in a quieter, more shadowed corner of a Scottish castle, watching Mary, Queen of Scots, settle herself into a tall, narrow wooden tub. This is no leisurely, candle-lit bath. It's what her physicians call a medicinal soak. The water, hauled from a nearby spring, is infused with powdered sulfur, a treatment she believes will strengthen her health and purify her skin. Mary eases into the water slowly, her long gown of thin linen still clinging to her form. Yes, she bathes clothed. It's a custom meant to protect modesty, and some say to guard against immodest thoughts, though the practical effect is that the linen soaks up the mineral scent like a sponge. Historians still argue whether these sulfur baths were part of a genuine medical regimen, or simply an indulgence she enjoyed under the guise of treatment. The water itself is warm, but not hot, cloudy from the minerals, with a faint yellow cast. As you lean in, you catch a sharper tang, the unmistakable smell of sulfur, like eggs left too long in the sun. Mary doesn't seem to mind. She closes her eyes, letting her hands float on the surface, while a maid slowly pours more of the mineral water over her hair. Strands cling together, heavy and dark, the scent winding itself into each lock. These baths are thought to help everything from joint pain to skin blemishes. Whether they actually do is another matter. The sulfur certainly cleanses in its own way, killing certain bacteria, but it leaves behind an unmistakable trail. Anyone who comes near Mary for the rest of the day will know exactly where she's been. When she emerges, her linen shift is wrung out and hung near the fire, the steam rising in ghostly plumes. She wraps herself in a heavy wool cloak, and one of her attendants rubs her hands with rose-scented oil soften the dryness. The floral sweetness battles with the lingering sulfur in a strange, uneasy duet. It's worth noting that her bathing habits are not constant. There are stretches when travel or politics make such soaks impossible. In those times, she reverts to the dry grooming common to her era: linen cloths, scented powders, and small pouches of dried herbs worn at the waist. But when the opportunity arises, she makes time for the mineral waters, sometimes even traveling to natural springs reputed to have stronger healing powers. Tonight, she sits near the fire afterward, her skin pink from the warmth, the room thick with the mingled smells of damp wool, rose oil, and sulfur. You can almost hear the hiss of the water cooling in the abandoned tub. Outside, the Scottish wind rattles the shutters, but here inside, the air is heavy, still, and faintly eggy. Mary sips from a cup of spiced wine, the cinnamon and clove lifting briefly above the mineral scent before fading again. She smiles faintly, as though imagining herself in a sunnier place, far from the damp stone walls. And you, breathing shallowly now, realize that in her mind, this is refreshment. This is renewal. A bath that doesn't just cleanse the body, but marks it with the unmistakable signature of the Queen's chosen comfort. You drift now into the early 19th century, where velvet drapes hold back the afternoon light in a Parisian townhouse. Inside, the air is so saturated with scent that you can almost see it, thin ribbons of perfume curling and twisting above the furniture. This is the realm of Empress Josephine, the first wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the very definition of olfactory excess. Josephine does not merely wear perfume, she lives inside it. The fragrance of choice is musk, layered with notes of vanilla and amber, applied in amounts that make subtlety impossible. She begins the ritual in the morning, dabbing oil onto her wrists, behind her ears, at the hollow of her throat. Then she spritzes a floral water over her hair, letting it settle into the curls. But that's only the base coat. Her gowns, of which there are many, are themselves infused with scent. Servants brush them daily with cloths dipped in perfume, a process that leaves the fabric almost damp. You watch as she lifts a sleeve to adjust it, and the air around you shifts as if a door has opened in a perfume shop. Historians still argue whether she used so much because she adored it personally, or because she believed it projected an aura of exotic allure to everyone around her. Even her rooms participate in this fragrant siege. Potpourri sits in porcelain bowls on every table, dried petals mingled with spices and citrus peel. Linen sachets of musk and rose are tucked into the folds of curtains and under the cushions of chairs. The scent is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of her life that guests leave smelling faintly of her perfume, whether they want to or not. The obsession runs deep. Letters reveal that Napoleon, when away on campaign, wrote to her requesting she not bathe before he arrived, so he could breathe in her natural scent. One wonders how much of that natural aroma was simply the thick layering of musk and amber. Either way, Josephine seems to have taken the request seriously. By afternoon, the heat of the day has intensified the perfume until it's almost dizzying. You sit beside her as she flips through a botanical illustration book, her fingers leaving faint, oily marks where the perfume has soaked into the paper. She pauses over an image of a tropical flower, closes her eyes, and inhales as though she can pull the scent from the page itself. Perfume in her time is not just about beauty. It's also about masking the unavoidable odors of early 19th century life. Coal smoke, horse manure in the streets, the human press of bodies in salons and theaters. But Josephine's approach is not about masking. It's about overwhelming. The scent becomes her armor, her signature, her declaration of self. As you leave the room, your clothes have already absorbed it: musk, amber, a hint of rose. Hours later, you'll still catch it in your hair, stubborn and persistent. And you realize that in her world, the point isn't to smell clean in the way we think of it now. It's to leave a mark on the senses, to become unforgettable even in absence. The room you enter now is sweltering, almost oppressive. Heavy velvet curtains seal out the draft, and the walls are draped in thick brocade. You can feel the heat before you even see her, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, seated in a gilded armchair, her gown pooling around her like a richly embroidered blanket. The air is dense, the kind that sticks to your skin, and you realize quickly that the warmth is not accidental. Catherine keeps her chambers heated well beyond what most would consider comfortable. In the Russian winter, this makes a certain kind of sense, but in the shoulder seasons, when the air outside is mild, the interior of her rooms becomes a stifling cocoon. Servants feed the ceramic stoves constantly, ensuring the temperature never drops. The result is a space where fabrics, furniture, and people alike seem to absorb the heat, and along with it, every scent in the room. Her gown is of heavy silk, layered and lined, and it has been worn more than once without washing. In her era, fine garments are rarely laundered. Instead, they are brushed, spot cleaned, and aired out. But here in the overheated chambers, any hint of perspiration lingers stubbornly. Historians still argue whether Catherine avoided frequent bathing out of personal preference or practicality. After all, winter bathing in Russia was a logistical challenge, even for an empress. But there's no doubt that water played a smaller role in her daily routine than layers of perfume and fabric. She wears scent, yes, but it's faint compared to the wall of air around her, a whisper of citrus and amber that struggles to push back against the closeness of the room. You watch as a maid fans her with a feathered device, more a symbol of service than an effective cooling method. Catherine waves her away, preferring stillness over the disturbance of moving air. The heat serves another purpose: comfort. She suffered from ailments that she believed were eased by keeping her body warm, especially her joints. But it also creates an environment where every texture, every breath feels heavy. When she leans forward to sign a document, the subtle creak of her stays and the faint musk of warmed silk reach you in equal measure. Her attendants move quietly, swapping out linens on the writing table, replacing the samovar's tea, brushing invisible dust from the gown's hem. No one seems to acknowledge the thickness of the air, though you suspect they're used to emerging from these rooms with flushed cheeks and damp collars. And yet, there's an undeniable magnetism here. The heat slows time, makes every gesture deliberate. Catherine's voice, low and measured, seems to roll through the air like warm syrup. She commands attention not just through her words, but through the sheer, enveloping presence of the space she inhabits. When you finally step back toward the corridor, the cooler air outside feels like a plunge into water. You take a deep breath and realize that you're carrying some of that heaviness with you, the warmth clinging to your clothes, the scent of silk and faint amber still caught in your hair. For Catherine, perhaps, that was the point. To create a space where the atmosphere itself became part of her power, where even the air remembered her long after you'd gone. The corridors you follow now lead north, to the crisp air of 17th century Stockholm, though that freshness stops the moment you step inside Queen Christina of Sweden's private chambers. Here, the smell is not of musk or incense, but of fresh linen, lots of it. Christina is famous, or perhaps infamous, for her daily ritual, changing her shirt every day, sometimes twice, yet avoiding water for weeks at a time. The shirt in question isn't just a shirt as we think of it, it's fine linen, cut loose, meant to sit next to the skin and soak up whatever the body might produce in the absence of bathing. In Christina's mind, the act of changing linen equals cleanliness. You watch as she peels one off, the fabric soft and faintly yellowed, and a lady-in-waiting presents another, crisp and cool, still holding the faint scent of the lavender it was stored with. Historians still argue whether this practice was born of genuine belief in the purifying power of linen or sheer practicality. In a climate where water was often cold and bathing facilities rudimentary. What's certain is that in Christina's court, the practice spread. Nobles and attendants followed her lead, swapping linen often, but rarely stepping into an actual tub. The queen herself moves through her rooms in a loose robe, her newly changed linen peeking out at the collar and cuffs. She seems perfectly content, sipping wine while reading aloud from a book of philosophy. The air is cool here, unlike Catherine the Great's overheated chambers, but the absence of bathing gives the space a subtle human note beneath the lavender and wood smoke. It's not unpleasant, exactly, just lived in. On a low bench, a basket of yesterday's shirts waits to be sent for washing. They will be boiled, beaten, and bleached in the sun before being folded away again. Christina takes pride in the whiteness of her linens, and in a time when white could mean anything from cream to gray, hers truly glow. It is, in its own way, a kind of status symbol, proof she has the means to own and maintain such quantities of fine fabric. A maid enters quietly, carrying a silver box of scented sachets. These are slipped into storage chests so that each shirt emerges smelling faintly of herbs and flowers. You notice there's no soap in the process, at least not for skin only for the cloth. Soap for the body is rare here, sometimes avoided entirely for fear it might damage the health. Christina seems unconcerned by the modern notion of freshness. Instead, she exudes a brisk energy, the kind of person more interested in conversation than cosmetics. As she leans in to make a dry joke about the philosopher she's been reading, the scent of linen and lavender mingles with the faintest trace of natural skin. And then, without fanfare, she begins pulling at the cuff of her sleeve, a signal to her maid that the evening change is due. Another shirt will be brought, warm from the press, and the cycle will continue. The water in her pitcher remains untouched, the basin still dry. In this world, cleanliness is measured not by soap and steam, but by the rustle of freshly laundered linen sliding over your shoulders. You find yourself now in the echoing corridors of the Habsburg court, where the scent hits you before the sight does, an unmistakable, earthy tang, with a hint of something cooked too long. When you step into the presence of Maria Theresa, ruler of the sprawling Austrian Empire, you realize it isn't her perfume that fills the air, but the lingering ghost of her diet. Maria Theresa is a devoted eater of cabbage in all its forms, boiled, pickled, stewed, sometimes even baked into pastries. In her time, cabbage is a cheap, filling staple, loaded with vitamins, and valued for keeping scurvy at bay during long winters. But here's the thing about cabbage. It does not go quietly. The smell clings, settling into fabric, hair, and breath. She sits at a long table, quill in hand, reading petitions from courtiers. A covered dish beside her sends faint tendrils of steam upward, betraying another serving of braised cabbage and onions. You think you catch a whiff of cloves, an attempt, perhaps, to temper the aroma, but the vegetable's stubborn pungency wins the battle. Historians still argue whether her fondness for this dish was born from childhood comfort food or from a belief in its medicinal properties. At court banquets, cabbage often appears dressed up with butter, cream, or even sugar, but it is still cabbage. And because bathing is infrequent in the imperial household, the scent lingers on the skin, and clothing long after the meal has ended. The warmth of the grand reception rooms only amplifies it. You notice that her attendants keep small pomanders, metal spheres filled with herbs at hand, which they lift discreetly to their noses between tasks. These are not for offense, but for balance, a way to blend the vegetable's earthiness with something brighter. Still, even with rosemary and lemon peel in play, the undercurrent remains. Maria Theresa, for her part, seems unbothered. She is a formidable presence, with an air that suggests she does not have time for vanity when there are empires to manage and wars to fund. She signs decrees, consults maps, and occasionally pauses to spear another bite from the plate beside her. And yet, there is a strange intimacy to this setting. The cabbage is not just food, it's a constant, a quiet reminder of the Empress's habits and tastes. It seeps into the brocade of her gown, into the carved wood of the dining chair, into the woolen shawl draped over the backrest. You imagine that if someone were to stumble into this room 100 years from now, they might still swear they caught a faint, ghostly whiff of boiled greens. When she finally rises, the skirts of her dress swish gently, releasing another wave of the scent into the air. It mingles with candle smoke and the polish of the parquet floor, creating a blend you will not forget. You follow her out, half-dazed, and realize the cabbage trail is not confined to the dining chamber. It goes with her, woven invisibly into the fabric of her reign. The palace corridors take you east now, to the marble-bright world of 19th century Vienna, where Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to history as Sissy, moves like a restless shadow. Her beauty is legendary, but so too is her relentless, almost obsessive hair care routine. And as you trail her into her private dressing room, you discover the secret at the heart of it: vinegar. Her hair is impossibly long, reaching well past her knees, a chestnut river that ripples when she moves. It takes hours each day for her ladies to brush it, untangling each strand as if it were spun gold. And when it's time for cleansing, the method is not warm water and scented soap, but vinegar, diluted, yes, but still sharp enough to sting the air. The mixture is poured slowly over her head, sluicing down through her hair, while the maids catch the runoff in a basin. The smell fills the chamber, instantly bracing, acidic, enough to make your eyes water if you're too close. Historians still argue whether Sissy's choice was purely cosmetic, meant to strip away residue and leave a glossy sheen, or whether she believed the vinegar had protective, even medicinal qualities. What's certain is that this process demands patience. After the rinse, her hair is wrapped in linen to dry, no vigorous rubbing, just gentle pressing. The vinegar scent lingers, clinging to the damp strands, and subtly perfuming the air around her for the rest of the day. You notice that the chamber is lined with windows, and when weather permits, she prefers them open, letting fresh air mingle with the sour-sweet aroma. Sissy is famously private, and she dislikes anyone watching her eat. But hair care is different. It is a ritual, almost a performance, albeit a slow one. Her ladies chatter in low voices as they work, occasionally pausing to examine the ends for damage or to untangle an especially stubborn knot. Somewhere in the background, a clock ticks in the long pauses between pours of the vinegar, and it's not just the scent you notice. The vinegar seems to weave itself into the fabric of the palace. The towels smell faintly of it. The combs and brushes carry a ghost of it in their bristles. Even the polished wood of the dressing table seems to hold a trace. You imagine guests leaning in for a courtly bow and catching that faint, tangy whisper without quite knowing what it is. Sissy herself seems immune to the smell, as if years of the ritual have dulled her awareness of it. She speaks quietly to a maid about the day's appointments, unconcerned by the droplets sliding down her back or the faintly puckered skin of her hands from handling the acidic water. This, after all, is the price of beauty, one she is more than willing to pay. As you slip away, you catch a final glimpse of the linen-wrapped hair hanging down her back, darkened to near black by the damp. It will dry slowly, the vinegar scent releasing in gentle waves, a quiet halo around a woman who has turned her beauty regimen into a palace-wide perfume. You step now into a world far from the cold corridors of Europe, the warm, heavy air of ancient Egypt. The palace hums with the slow rhythm of fans made from ostrich feathers, and at the center of it all sits Cleopatra. She reclines on a low couch, skin glowing in the lamplight, her scent unmistakable, a mixture of honey, milk, and whatever exotic oils her attendants have seen fit to add today. This is no accident. Cleopatra's baths are the stuff of legend, warm milk blended with honey until the liquid turns opalescent, poured into carved stone tubs deep enough to sink into. She claims it keeps her skin soft and luminous, a belief shared by many in her time. The milk's lactic acid is said to gently exfoliate the honey to preserve youth. Historians still argue whether she bathed in milk daily or reserved it for ceremonial occasions. But either way, the result is the same. An unmistakable sweetness that clings to her. You watch as attendants ladle the mixture over her arms and shoulders, the honey thick enough to catch the candlelight before melting into her skin. The room smells warm and golden, like a pastry shop at dusk. But here's the truth no court poet will put into verse. Honey is sticky. And in a warm Egyptian climate, it doesn't take long for that stickiness to catch dust and flies. The attendants are quick with palm fronds, shooing away any winged interlopers drawn by the sweetness. Cleopatra, however, seems utterly at ease, her dark hair gleaming with oil, her gold bracelets catching the flicker of the lamps. She is a woman entirely in control of her image, and if that image includes a scent so strong it practically walks into the room ahead of her, so be it. You suspect she relishes the idea that people will remember her not just for her beauty or power, but for the way she smelled asterisk, a living perfume, impossible to forget. When she rises, the milk honey glaze has been replaced by a faint sheen, her skin luminous. The sweetness trails behind her like a living veil as she moves through the palace, mingling with the smells of incense, baked bread, and lotus blossoms. Even hours later, you find the air around you carries that faint, decadent note, an ancient luxury with a modern problem. It doesn't fade quickly, and now, as the corridors grow quieter, the world slows. The torchlight flickers, the last of the fans sway gently overhead, and you feel yourself slipping into that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. Hey guys, tonight we drift into a warm, perfumed haze that's not quite as pleasant as it first sounds. The year is somewhere in the mid-1500s, and you are standing in a courtyard in Renaissance Italy. Marble fountains gurgle lazily in the afternoon heat, and above them, the windows of the ducal palace are thrown open to catch a breeze that never quite arrives. Your shoes tap softly on the polished stone, as you follow a trail of faint rosewater, cinnamon, and something else you can't quite name, like the inside of a spice chest that's been left in the sun. The scent belongs to the Duchess herself, a woman whose beauty is whispered about in every corridor, though perhaps not always for the right reasons. She glides into view in a gown so heavy with embroidery it could stop a crossbow bolt, her skirts swaying gently as she walks. You notice the oddest thing. Now and then, a ripple in the hem that doesn't match her stride. It's subtle, but you've been around enough noble courts by now to sense when something under the fabric is alive. You learn the truth later, when an attendant leans in with a conspiratorial smirk. The Duchess keeps tiny, perfumed mice hidden in pockets sewn inside her skirts. Each one is dabbed with a mixture of rose oil, crushed cloves, and according to the servant, a pinch of ground ambergris, that strange waxy substance harvested from the guts of whales. In theory, this masks the less than fresh scent of someone who wears layers of brocade in a climate where air conditioning means opening a window toward the river. The idea is simple enough. As the mice scurry gently inside her gown, their movements help release the perfume. And because they're alive, they generate warmth, which supposedly diffuses the scent more effectively. Historians still argue whether this was a common court trick or just the peculiar whim of one eccentric duchess. From where you stand, the effect is mixed. When she passes, the air blooms briefly with roses and spice, but linger too long in her wake, and you begin to catch the faint, unavoidable undertone of mouse. Not the clean, storybook mouse of illustrations, but the earthy, slightly ammoniac smell that no amount of rose oil can fully hide. At one point during a banquet, one of the perfumed creatures decides to peek its head from beneath her hem, blinking at the candlelight. The Duchess calmly scoops it back into hiding, never breaking her conversation about Venetian glassware. No one at the table dares react, except for you, though you mask your surprise behind a sip of watered wine. You wonder about the mice themselves. Are they pampered, little royal pets living a life of scented luxury? Or do they see the Duchess's gown as an endless maze they can never quite escape? Perhaps both. Either way, the image is fixed in your mind. A grand lady sweeping through her palace, trailing rose-scented rodents like living sachets. It's a strange thing, the lengths to which people will go for the illusion of cleanliness, or rather, the illusion of fragrance. Because as you stand here, you realize fragrance isn't always the same as freshness. Sometimes it's just a clever distraction. You find yourself now under the gilded ceilings of Versailles, where the light pours in through towering windows and settles in lazy pools on the polished parquet floors. You move through the hall of mirrors, each step echoing faintly, the air tinged with a mixture of beeswax, powdered wigs, and something far less dignified. Ahead, the crowd gathers, not for a ball or a diplomatic reception, but for what can only be described as a courtly pastime, the lice-comb games of Louis XIV. Yes, the Sun King, paragon of absolute monarchy and gold-laced grandeur, presides over a peculiar ritual that combines hygiene, performance, and, strangely enough, competition. You edge closer, careful not to bump into the puffed sleeves and feathered hats of the courtiers. On an ornate chaise sits the king himself, dressed in a silken dressing gown that shimmers like molten bronze under the candlelight. His wig, monstrous, curling, and likely harboring a few mysteries of its own, rests on a stand beside him. Today, though, it's not the wig that has everyone's attention. A liveried servant steps forward with a long, thin comb of ivory. He begins parting the Sun King's natural hair, searching slowly, deliberately, for the tiny invaders that thrive in the warm thicket above the royal ears. You watch as the servant plucks something with a small flourish and drops it onto a sheet of black velvet, so it can be seen clearly by all. The courtiers murmur appreciatively. It's a good one, they seem to say, plump, wriggling, full of the king's own essence. In this odd social theater, catching a particularly large or lively louse is a small victory, worthy of nods and quiet praise. Historians still argue whether this was a daily necessity or a kind of ritualized bonding between monarch and court, but you can see how it works. It makes the king's very body a shared concern, an emblem of intimacy and loyalty. And of course, it's not just the king who receives such attention. Inside chambers, other nobles take part in their own lice hunts, each with a personal servant or favored companion acting as groomer-in-chief. Sometimes, the catch is even kept sealed in tiny glass vials as a bizarre token of the event. You can picture a courtier tucking such a vial away to later boast, "This one was taken from His Majesty's nape on the feast of St. Louis." The atmosphere is light, almost playful. Someone cracks a joke about the louse being a traitor who tried to suck the king's vitality. Another suggests it should be knighted for its bravery. Laughter ripples through the crowd, but beneath it all, you feel the strangeness of the scene. Here, in one of the most magnificent palaces in Europe, the height of aristocratic entertainment involves inspecting the scalp of the most powerful man in France. You glance toward the open balcony doors. Outside, the gardens stretch in perfect symmetry, the fountains catching the sun in 1,000 silver arcs. The air out there is crisp, clean, untainted by pomade and powder. But in here, you remain a captive audience to a very different kind of royal spectacle, one that reminds you that even kings must scratch now and then. And as you watch the comb glide again through the thick, dark hair, you can't help but think, perfume and powdered wigs may mask much, but the humble louse pays no heed to rank. It treats the head of a king the same as that of a beggar. And perhaps that's why this odd little ritual feels almost democratic in its itchy, uncomfortable way. The next stop in your slow, meandering walk through history is not a palace, but the stifling interior of a traveling carriage, somewhere along a rutted road between Edinburgh and London in the early 1700s. You sit across from a Scottish duchess whose name you can't quite pronounce without tripping over the syllables. Outside, countryside blurs by, fields of heather giving way to damp forests, the air thick with the smell of peat fires from unseen cottages. Inside, however, the air is different, heavier, richer, almost aggressively so. At first you assume it's her perfume, a strong lavender note, spiked with something sharper, maybe vinegar. But the longer you sit, the more you realize the scent is not on her skin at all. It's coming from somewhere much lower. She leans forward to tell you about her journey, her voice lilting with a practiced charm. Her gown creaks softly as she moves, layers of wool and silk shifting with the rhythm of the road. Then you catch it, a faint slosh, a sound so out of place it makes you blink. It turns out the Duchess is an enthusiastic user of what she calls her traveling comfort pot, a small, lidded chamber pot tucked beneath her many skirts. Why stop for roadside facilities, she explains, when you can conduct your business discreetly without ever leaving your seat? The design is clever enough. The pot's rim fits snugly into a wooden frame that sits on the carriage bench, concealed entirely by her voluminous gown. The skirt's heavy fabric even traps some of the scent, though, judging by the vinegar tang, she also employs a splash of that sharp liquid to sweeten the air. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice among noblewomen, or simply an eccentric habit of certain individuals with a distaste for roadside inns. You imagine the practicality of it on long, wet journeys, but also the sheer boldness of sharing a confined carriage with company while quietly relieving oneself mid-conversation. You try to focus on her story about an argument at court involving a stolen snuff box. But it's difficult when you know the gentle rocking of the carriage isn't the only thing creating that faint liquid ripple. The Duchess, for her part, seems completely unbothered, perhaps even a little proud of her efficiency. A lady, she says with a satisfied smile, should never let nature dictate her schedule. The road stretches on for hours. At one point, the horses slow to navigate a muddy bend, and the carriage jolts. You grip the window frame for balance, while she steadies her skirts with one practiced hand. You think about the poor footman who will later be tasked with emptying and rinsing that pot, vinegar and all, before it's packed away for the next leg of the journey. When the carriage finally stops for the night, the Duchess rises gracefully, her skirts swaying as she steps down to the inn's cobbled courtyard. She moves as though nothing at all unusual has occurred, leaving you to follow with the faint but unmistakable scent of vinegar still clinging to your clothes. And as you trail behind her into the flickering candlelight of the inn, you can't help but reflect. Sometimes royal convenience is less about luxury and more about simply not having to say, "Can we pull over?" You wander now into the quiet, candlelit bedchamber of Catherine de Medici, that formidable Queen of France, whose sharp political instincts were matched only by her flair for the unsettling. The air here is cool, perfumed faintly with crushed roses and the smoky whisper of beeswax candles. At first glance, It's all elegance, silken bed hangings, a carved walnut dressing table, and the faint sheen of gold leaf on the furniture. But the longer you stand in the room, the more your eyes adjust to something odd. There, along the edges of the great four-poster bed, you notice little ridges, tiny raised lines, dark against the pale linen. You lean closer, and the truth clicks into place. These are dried rings of garlic paste, carefully smeared into a continuous border. Catherine, you soon learn, believed with absolute conviction that garlic was the most effective deterrent, not only against evil spirits and poison vapors, but also against lice, fleas, and the kind of suitors she had no patience for. She instructed her servants to apply it liberally along the seams of her sheets, the joints of her headboard, and even the hems of her underskirts. If you were to sit too close during an audience, you'd be met with a sharp, almost medicinal tang that clung to her gowns like a stubborn shadow. Historians still argue whether she picked up this habit from Italian folk remedies or whether it was her own invention. But accounts from courtiers mention entire rooms reeking faintly of garlic after she passed through. The effect, they say, was polarizing. Some saw it as a clever shield against disease in an era obsessed with bad air, while others whispered it was a sign of paranoia, or worse, witchcraft. You sit gently on the edge of the bed, feeling the faint roughness of the garlic border beneath your fingertips. Imagine lying here at night, wrapped in silk sheets, but surrounded by a barrier of pungent protection. The scent would rise with the warmth of your body, curling up into your dreams, making even your sleep a faintly seasoned affair. And it didn't stop at the bed. Catherine reportedly had her gloves dusted with powdered garlic before court appearances, ensuring that any polite kiss of the hand came with a little olfactory surprise. At feasts, she might even have a few cloves tucked discreetly into her bodice, not for flavor, but for comfort. You glance toward the heavy curtains, wondering how the courtiers endured long winter evenings in this space without their eyes watering. Yet, there's something strangely comforting in her logic. Garlic was cheap, readily available, and if nothing else, kept unwanted pests, human and otherwise, at a distance. As you leave the chamber, a cool draft follows you down the corridor, but so does that lingering aroma. And you realize that, for all her political maneuvering, Catherine's most lasting invisible weapon might have been the one clinging to her linens, her gowns, and the very air she inhabited. The stone floor beneath your feet is damp and cold as you step into a vaulted chamber in the Hofburg Palace, Vienna, sometime in the late 1700s. The walls sweat faintly in the winter chill, their pale plaster dim under the flickering of tallow candles. This is where you find Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, sister to the formidable Maria Theresa, engaged in a nightly ritual, so odd you're not entirely sure she isn't preparing soup. She sits by a low copper basin, steam curling upward in delicate spirals. At first you think she's simply soaking her feet, but then your nose catches it. the unmistakable smell of boiled onions. Not roasted, not spiced, just plain, slightly sweet onions. A whole basin full of their cloudy broth, still warm from the kitchen. She leans back in her high-backed chair, skirts hitched up just enough to bare her calves, and lowers both feet into the pale yellow water with a sigh that could melt snow. The servants, standing at a discreet distance, seem accustomed to the scent. One of them will later ladle the liquid into smaller jars, cork them tightly, and store them in a dark cabinet, because the Archduchess swears by reusing the same onion water for at least 3 nights in a row. Historians still argue whether this habit was intended for softening skin, warding off colds, or simply as an indulgence for sore feet after a day pacing the palace corridors. Whatever the reason, Maria Anna took it seriously. On more than one occasion, she reportedly delayed a state meeting until her onion time was complete. The warmth in the room is thick with the aroma, and you can't help thinking of a winter stew. But this is not a dish you'd want to ladle over bread. The scent clings to your hair and sleeves, almost tangible. You shift in your seat, wondering if this counts as aromatherapy or just a very elaborate way to smell like a root cellar. At her side table sits a small tin of goose fat. Once her feet have soaked long enough, she'll pat them dry with linen towels and rub in the fat to seal in the heat. The combination is not subtle. You imagine that later, when she's tucked into bed, the scent will mingle with the feather mattress and linger until morning, possibly until spring. As the basin cools, the Archduchess closes her eyes, clearly content. The palace may be echoing with court intrigue and imperial business, but in this moment, she is a woman with warm feet, fragrant ankles, and absolutely no shame about it. And when you finally leave, stepping back into the drafty hallway, you carry with you a small, stubborn curl of onion-scented steam, the quiet souvenir of an imperial footbath. You find yourself padding softly along a dim, echoing corridor in Hampton Court Palace, where the air smells faintly of damp stone and old beeswax. A door creaks open to your right, revealing a warm, low-lit room lined with shelves of small ceramic jars, each labeled in spidery handwriting. This is the private chamber of Queen Mary II of England, late 1600s, and tonight she's in the mood for one of her healthful winter restoratives. At the center of the room sits a heavy oak table. Upon it, a servant is carefully unwrapping something swaddled in cloth. A large, sticky lump of brownish material that looks unsettlingly like a melted candle. The servant slices it into smaller chunks, revealing an oddly sweet smell beneath the waxy surface. You lean closer and realize it's asterisk candied whale skin. Mary believed this rare delicacy, imported from Arctic whaling expeditions, could fortify the humors when nibbled before bed. It wasn't for flavor. The taste was apparently a mix between stale honey and the inside of a fishing net, but rather for its supposed warming properties. Tonight, she's going one step further, she's going to rub it into her skin. She sits before the fire, hair in loose braids, and a jar of warmed almond oil beside her. The candied whale skin is mashed into the oil until it becomes a grainy paste, and then slowly, methodically, she works it into her arms, shoulders, and even her temples. The logic, according to her physicians, is that the whale oil's essence will seep into her body through the pores, keeping her joints supple through the cold months. Historians still argue whether she genuinely believed in its medicinal effects, or whether she simply enjoyed the luxury of possessing something so rare that only a handful of royal households could obtain it. Either way, the smell is persistent. Sweet at first, then fishy, then sweet again in an exhausting cycle. You imagine lying in bed with that aroma, rising like an invisible tide around you, slowly mingling with the feather pillows. As the queen massages her wrists, she hums softly, clearly relaxed. The servants keep the fire high, perhaps to mask the scent with smoke. You sit quietly, resisting the urge to open a window, and watch the candlelight glint off her skin, now slick and faintly shimmering. When she finally retires, her sheets, already scented faintly with lavender, will carry this oceanic perfume well into the next day. And if she meets a courtier in the morning, they might politely pretend not to notice the curious mingling of spa day and shipyard clinging to the air around her. The stone steps spiral downward into a cooler, quieter wing of the Escorial, Spain, where the faint scent of incense still clings to the air from the morning chapel service. You step into a small but ornate chamber, its ceiling painted with soft gold stars against a midnight blue. Here, in the mid-1500s, you find Princess Juana of Austria, sister to King Philip II, engaged in an evening beauty ritual that feels more like a bakery experiment gone wrong. In the center of the room is a polished walnut vanity table, and on it sits a shallow bowl of pale yellow dough. A maid kneads the mixture with patient hands, folding and pressing until it's smooth. You notice it's flecked with something powdered cinnamon, and the scent is rich and warm. At first, you think it's bread dough. Then the maid dips her fingers in and begins smoothing it directly onto the princess's face. The paste, you learn, is a blend of ground wheat flour, fresh goat's milk, honey, and a pinch of cinnamon, meant to soften the skin, prevent freckles, and, according to Juana's personal physician, draw out the corrupt airs of the day. The effect is less spa day luxury and more someone accidentally face-planted into a cake batter bowl. Historians still argue whether this mixture had any real cosmetic effect, or whether it was simply another excuse for the princess to surround herself with comforting kitchen scents. Either way, she insisted the mask remain on for an entire hour before bed. And she never rinsed it off with water, no. That would be wasteful. Instead, she'd let it crust slightly, then gently scrape it away with a small ivory paddle, sending little flakes of dried dough onto the marble floor like a very slow snowfall. As you watch, a servant lays out her nightclothes, which are faintly dusted with powder from previous evenings. You imagine climbing into bed your face smelling faintly of cinnamon rolls. Your pillow forever on the brink of becoming breakfast. The warm, sweet aroma seeps into your own thoughts until you're half tempted to lick the air. The princess, however, is serene, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, breathing slowly through her nose, as though inhaling the very essence of comfort. Outside, the night air is cool, but in here the candlelight and the smell of honeyed milk make the world feel small and safe, even if your cheeks now look like they belong in a pastry shop window. You drift through the echoing halls of the Swedish royal palace in the early 1700s, where the winter air presses cold fingers against the leaded windows. A faint, unmistakable smell, equal parts sour and floral, guides you to a small dressing chamber tucked behind Queen Ulrika Eleonora's apartments. Inside, the queen herself sits before a gilt-framed mirror, a thin muslin cloth draped around her shoulders, while two ladies-in-waiting hover nearby, holding stoppered glass bottles. The first bottle, when unsealed, sends a sharp tang through the room, vinegar infused with rose petals. The petals, once soft and pink, are now pale and limp, floating like tired little ghosts in the cloudy liquid. One lady dips a strip of linen into the vinegar, wrings it out, and begins to dab it along the queen's hairline, temples, and behind her ears. Ulrika closes her eyes, clearly savoring the sensation. She believes, as do many in her court, that this concoction purifies the blood through the skin and keeps her complexion pale and even. The second bottle is even stranger. Vinegar steeped with crushed cloves and a few shavings of deer antler. This is reserved for her hands, wrists, and oddly her knees. Historians still argue whether the deer antler component was meant as a magical charm, a medical tonic, or simply a very expensive conversation piece in the queen's bathroom cabinet. What's certain is that the resulting scent is a peculiar marriage of salad dressing and perfumery, one that clings stubbornly to fabrics and hair. The vinegar ritual is followed by a slow brushing of her hair with a boar bristle brush, each stroke carefully counted, 50 on one side, 50 on the other. The acid from the vinegar makes her hair gleam in the candlelight, but also leaves a faintly pickled aroma hovering in the air. You can't decide whether it's refreshing or slightly alarming. When the queen finally stands, the muslin cloth is whisked away and replaced with her nightgown. The vinegar bottles are stoppered again, though the scent seems unwilling to retreat. As you step back into the corridor, you realize your own hair has caught the faintest trace of it, a souvenir that might follow you until morning, whether you want it to or not. You step quietly into a chamber deep within the Hofburg Palace, Vienna, sometime in the mid-1700s. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the winter chill, and the only light comes from a small cluster of beeswax candles arranged in a circle on the parquet floor. In the center of this dim halo sits Empress Maria Theresa herself, surrounded by an assortment of glass jars, pewter bowls, and oddly, a shallow copper pan that smells faintly of warmed milk. She is in the midst of what her ladies call the asterisk night vapor. A servant ladles hot milk into the copper pan, and another sprinkles in crushed marigold petals, and a spoonful of powdered pearl. The mixture begins to steam gently, sending up a faintly sweet mineral scent. The Empress leans forward over it, a linen cloth draped over her head to trap the vapor, inhaling deeply through her nose. She believes this ritual clears the lungs, softens the skin, and drives away cold humors that might settle overnight. Historians still argue whether the powdered pearl was ever intended for inhalation, or if Maria Theresa simply repurposed an expensive facial additive into a multitasking luxury. Either way, the steam clings to her face, leaving a faint dew that her attendants blot delicately with embroidered towels. Once the vapor is finished, the milk, now cooled, is not discarded. Instead, it's poured into a wide porcelain basin, and the Empress slips her feet into it, closing her eyes as though the warmth is seeping into her very bones. The marigold petals float lazily against her ankles, and the powdered pearl swirls like moonlight in the cloudy water. The room is quiet, except for the faint ticking of a travel clock, and the occasional soft splash as her toes move beneath the surface. You can't help imagining the mixture slowly turning sour overnight if left unattended, though her attendants are quick to remove it once she's done. When she finally rises, her cheeks are flushed, her hair damp at the edges, and her feet wrapped in soft linen. The air in the room feels heavy with steam and the faintly sweet scent of milk, comforting if you like dairy, a little claustrophobic if you don't. As she's led away to bed, you notice one candle guttering, its flame bending toward the last curls of vapor, as though reluctant to let the moment end. The night is damp and heavy over Florence in the late 1400s, and inside the Palazzo Medici, a single chamber glows with the pale flicker of oil lamps. You find yourself standing in the private rooms of Clarice Orsini, wife to Lorenzo de' Medici, just as she's preparing for bed. The walls here are hung with thick woolen tapestries, muffling the outside world, but nothing hides the sharp, pungent aroma rising from the bronze bowl on her dressing table. It's vinegar again, but this time it's been left to steep with crushed garlic, rosemary, and a splash of old wine. Clarice's maid dips a square of linen into the liquid, wrings it out, and presses it gently over her mistress's face like a mask. You watch the fabric cling and sag as the liquid soaks into her skin. She inhales deeply, the sharp scent filling the small room. The purpose, she insists, is not just cosmetic. This is her nightly guard against illness, plague, fever, bad air. In her mind, the garlic purifies, the vinegar seals, and the rosemary wards off evil spirits. Historians still argue whether this was rooted more in superstition than medicine, though the Medici family prided themselves on blending both. Once the cloth is removed, her cheeks are flushed from the sting of the vinegar, and her skin carries a faint sheen under the lamplight. But there's another step yet. Her maid takes the damp cloth, folds it, and places it beneath Clarice's pillow. This way, she says, the protective scent will linger through the night. The effect is intense. Even standing several feet away, you feel as though you've been dropped into the middle of a medieval kitchen during peak garlic season. The smell mingles with the faint sweetness of beeswax from the candles, producing something oddly comforting if you surrender to it, but undeniably invasive if you don't. Clarice slips into bed, her hair braided and pinned in a loose coil, the faint rustle of linen, and the slow creak of the bed frame the only sounds. The air feels thick with protective intention, as though every breath you take might shield you from invisible harm. You can't help but imagine waking in the morning with not only clear skin, but the distinct ability to repel both illness and dinner guests. A thin dawn light spills over the rooftops of Versailles, but you are not in the grand hall of mirrors. You're in a much smaller, private chamber tucked behind a labyrinth of servants' corridors. Here, Madame de Pompadour, the famous mistress of Louis XV, is engaging in what might be the most curious part of her nightly beauty routine. The bread mask asterisk. On a small marble table sits a bowl of milk in which torn chunks of stale white bread are slowly softening into a paste. The mixture smells faintly sweet and sour, a reminder that milk in the 18th century often came with a short shelf life. Once the bread has collapsed into soggy lumps, a serving woman stirs in a splash of rosewater and just a hint of honey. Madame leans back in her chair, eyes closed, while her attendants apply the mixture thickly across her face and neck. The paste is cool and slightly gritty, leaving behind little flecks of crust clinging like decorative crumbs. She swears by this as a complexion treatment, claiming it smooths the skin, brightens the cheeks, and draws out weariness after long evenings at court. Historians still argue whether this was an effective moisturizer or simply a way to repurpose kitchen scraps in the name of beauty. As the mask dries, it tightens, pulling faintly at her skin, making it difficult for her to speak. This doesn't stop her from attempting light conversation, though each word emerges a little muffled, as though she's chewing very slowly. You can't help but notice the absurdity. One of the most powerful women in France, sitting perfectly still, while her face slowly turns into a bread pudding. Once it's time to remove it, the attendants use warm cloths to wipe away the paste, the scent of milk and honey lingering faintly in the air. Any leftover mixture is unceremoniously tossed into the kitchen waste bucket, perhaps to be fed to pigs or chickens later, because nothing in Versailles goes entirely unused. When she finally rises, her skin does seem softer, glowing faintly in the morning light. But there's no escaping the strange image that will stick with you. A woman who could summon musicians, painters, and kings, ending her night with a face full of soggy bakery leftovers. The palace may run on gold and gossip, but sometimes it also runs on yesterday's bread. The year is 1539, and you are standing in a dim, timber-beamed chamber somewhere in the Tudor court. The air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax, rushlights, and something far less pleasant, fermented ale. This is the private night space of Anne of Cleves, Henry VII's fourth wife, and she's preparing for bed in a way that makes you question every romanticized painting you've ever seen. On a low stool sits a large earthenware pot filled with ale that has been left uncovered just long enough to turn sour. Floating on top are sprigs of thyme and sage, along with a thin layer of froth. Her lady-in-waiting dips a rag into this pungent mixture, wrings it out, and begins to wipe down Anne's arms and neck. This, she insists, will soften the skin and keep it warm against the night's chill. The ale bath, if you can call it that, is a well-known remedy among certain German households, and Anne brought it with her to England as part of her routine. She believes the sour ale draws out impurities and leaves the skin supple. Historians still argue whether this was an imported courtly trend or simply a deeply personal comfort habit. The sensation, Anne says, is cooling at first, then oddly warming as the alcohol evaporates. You notice a faint, sticky residue left behind, which her maid does not bother to rinse away. This means that by the time Anne is in bed, the sheets will inevitably smell faintly like a brewer's storeroom. It's not entirely unpleasant if you like the scent of yeast and herbs, though the idea of rolling over in the night and sticking slightly to the linen is less appealing. Anne seems content, though, leaning back against embroidered pillows, her hair brushed loose down her shoulders. As the candles are snuffed one by one, the last thing you see is the earthen pot still sitting in the corner, the ale dark and flat now, sprigs of thyme drooping like they've given up on their herbal career. Somewhere in the palace, the kitchens are alive with the smell of roasting meat. But here in Anne's chamber, the night will belong to barley, yeast, and a queen determined to sleep in her own strange comfort. The corridors of the Russian winter palace creak faintly under your feet as you follow the glow of a single oil lamp toward a chamber heavy with velvet drapes. Inside, Catherine the Great sits at her dressing table, though tonight there is no display of glittering jewels or elaborate wigs. Instead, the Empress is waiting for her maid to bring in a steaming wooden bucket filled with kvass. The drink halfway between beer and bread soup is a staple in Russian kitchens, but Catherine has repurposed it into a nightly hair rinse. The thick, dark liquid is poured slowly over her braids, soaking them until they drip with the smell of rye and faintly sour fermentation. You can almost hear the fizz as it trickles down. The theory here, according to her court hairdresser, is that kvass strengthens the hair and gives it a healthy shine, especially in the dry winter months when the palace air is parched from constant heating. Historians still argue whether this came from genuine folk tradition or was just one of Catherine's many experiments with combining luxury and rustic wisdom. Once her hair is thoroughly drenched, the maid squeezes out the excess liquid. The brownish runoff pattering onto the floorboards and soaking a sacrificial towel. There is no rinsing with water afterward, apparently. The secret is to let the kvass work overnight. This means Catherine will go to bed smelling faintly like a bakery crossed with a brewery, her pillow absorbing most of the evidence by morning. As you watch her settle in, you catch a glimpse of the frost on the window pane, tiny crystalline feathers spreading outward in the dim light. The palace beyond is silent, except for the occasional thud of snow slipping from the roof. It's oddly peaceful, just a woman, her hair dripping bread beer. The air a blend of winter cold and warm grain scent. And you can't help but think, if anyone could make sleeping with kvass in their hair sound regal, it would be Catherine the Great. You're somewhere deep in the dim, flickering candlelight of the 16th century Spanish court, and Queen Joanna, whom history would remember as Juana la Loca *, Joanna the Mad, is retiring for the night. The palace is unusually quiet, save for the faint rustle of her long skirts and the low murmur of her ladies-in-waiting. On a small walnut table near her bed, there's an assortment of earthen jars and folded cloths. One jar contains warmed olive oil infused with crushed rosemary. Another holds a gritty mixture of fine ash and ground seashells. This is Joanna's unusual foot ritual. The court physician claims it keeps the skin soft and prevents winter's cracks. But watching it unfold feels like half spa treatment, half campfire cleanup. Her maid begins by massaging the warmed oil into Joanna's feet, the scent of rosemary slowly filling the chamber. The glow of the oil catches in the candlelight, making her skin look almost bronzed. Then comes the ashen seashell mixture, rubbed gently over the soles as an exfoliant. The sensation, Joanna says in a rare moment of humor, reminds her of walking barefoot along a stony beach, except here there's no sea breeze, only the close air of a heavily curtained royal bedchamber. Historians still argue whether this method came from Moorish traditions, imported centuries earlier, or whether it was simply a local adaptation of household cleaning materials. Either way, it's an odd contrast. A queen surrounded by gold-threaded cushions, willingly letting her feet be scrubbed with what could just as easily have come from a kitchen hearth. After the scrubbing, her feet are wrapped in soft linen and left to breathe in the warm air before she slips into bed. The linens will be discarded in the morning, but the scent of rosemary clings faintly to the rugs and sheets. As the last candle is pinched out, you notice the silence of the room, thick, almost tangible. Somewhere beyond the heavy doors, the affairs of the Spanish Empire churn on. But here, in this little circle of warmth and oil and ash, time feels suspended. The corridors of Versailles are quiet tonight, but in a small, gilded chamber off the main apartments, Marie Antoinette is preparing for bed in a way that defies the delicate pastel portraits you've seen of her. She's perched in a cushioned chair, her silk dressing gown slipping off one shoulder, while a servant approaches with an oversized porcelain bowl filled not with scented water, but with a pale, cloudy liquid that smells faintly of sour milk. It's a mix of buttermilk and crushed violets, a concoction Marie swears by for keeping her skin smooth and luminous. The violets, their purple petals now wilted and soft, float on the surface like tiny paper boats. The buttermilk has been warmed slightly, just enough so the scent rises into the air. The servant dips a cloth into the bowl, then begins wiping Marie's arms, shoulders, and neck. The effect is not glamorous. The buttermilk leaves a thin, slightly tacky layer on the skin, and you can already imagine the stickiness against the fine linen sheets later. But Marie insists that in the morning, her skin will be comme une perche, like a peach. Historians still argue whether this habit came from actual 18th century beauty manuals, or if it's a later embellishment from her ever-growing legend. When the wiping is done, the violet petals are gathered and pressed gently against her cheeks, as though the faint perfume will seep into her pores overnight. The smell is both floral and faintly sour, the sort of aroma you might find in a forgotten bakery display beside an abandoned bouquet. Marie leans back, closing her eyes, seemingly unbothered by the sensation. Outside, the winter wind rattles faintly against the palace windows, but here in this little room, everything is warmth, candlelight, and the slow drip of buttermilk from cloth to porcelain. And as she finally rises to slip into bed, you realize that beneath the silks, jewels, and royal etiquette, there is a young woman convinced that a bit of spoiled dairy and wilted flowers might just hold the secret to beauty. A strangely human thought for a queen whose name would echo through history. The palace around you softens at the edges, as if the walls themselves are sighing into the night. Footsteps fade down distant corridors, replaced by the slow whisper of the desert wind curling through open doorways. The heavy perfumes, the vinegar tang, the cabbage musk, all the scents of our strange and winding journey begin to dissolve into something gentler, something easier to breathe. You imagine yourself walking back through each court, each chamber, but now the air is cooler, the light dimmer, the noise gone. Fabrics rustle softly in the dark, and somewhere a fountain trickles with lazy persistence. Time has slowed, the sharp edges of history rounding into a smooth, drifting calm. Your shoulders drop. The air feels warm, but not stifling, wrapping around you like a loosely woven blanket. You catch a final thread of honey on the breeze, not cloying now, just a faint sweetness that reminds you of distant kitchens and safe places. Every step you take feels slower, heavier, your mind beginning to let go of details, the names, the dates, the peculiar habits, and keeping only the lull of the voice in your ear, the low hum of a story finding its ending. Somewhere a door closes softly. The night deepens. You have traveled through centuries without moving, walked through worlds that no longer exist, and carried their strange truths with you into this quiet moment. Now, you are free to set them down. Let the last flickers of torchlight fade. Let the air grow still. and let your breathing match the gentle rhythm of the desert wind outside. You are here, you are safe, and the night has nothing more to ask of you. It's deep in the stone belly of an English castle, the kind of place where the air smells faintly of damp wool and yesterday's candle smoke. And Queen Elizabeth is seated in front of a small mirror, framed in tarnished silver. The torchlight flickers over her pale, almost luminescent face, not naturally pale, of course, but made so by the dense layer of white lead makeup she applies every evening. You've seen paintings of her with that porcelain sheen, but here, in the unflattering glow of open flame, the effect is less ethereal and more, well, unsettling. Her skin beneath it, by all accounts, is raw from years of this habit, but to her it is as essential as breathing. Tonight, though, the ritual isn't about putting the paint on, it's about taking it off. Her ladies-in-waiting approach with bowls of warm rosewater and soft cloths, the petals drifting lazily on the surface. But the rosewater is just the polite overture. The real cleansing solution is vinegar mixed with powdered eggshells and a pinch of alum, which they claim will draw out impurities and leave her fresh. Smell is sharp enough to make your eyes water, and the vinegar stings her skin in ways she no longer reacts to. It's a familiar burn, the kind you stop noticing after years of nightly repetition. The first cloth comes away streaked with ghostly white smears, and she watches each one with the focus of someone monitoring a tiny war. You notice how she doesn't speak while it happens, as if removing the mask requires a kind of reverence, or perhaps a moment of mourning for the image she sheds with each wipe. Somewhere in the back of the room, a maid grinds almonds into a fine paste with honey, readying the second stage of the routine. This part, Elizabeth actually enjoys. It's soft, sticky, and smells faintly of marzipan. The mixture is rubbed into her face in small circles, leaving behind a glistening layer that catches the light like a glaze on a pastry. Historians still argue whether this almond honey mask was a common Tudor remedy, or if it was something unique to her physician's experiments. But it's the one part of the evening where the Queen actually looks relaxed, almost content. One of her ladies jokes softly that the bees themselves would be honored to serve her, and Elizabeth's mouth twitches, just enough to betray a laugh she won't fully let out. After the mask has done its work, the maids rinse it away with warm milk, which slides down her neck in little rivulets, pooling in the lace edge of her nightgown. The milk leaves her smelling faintly sweet, but the moment you think the ordeal is over, another bowl is brought forward, this one filled with a pale yellow concoction that smells like herbs left too long in the sun. It's a chamomile infusion meant to calm the skin after the vinegar and lead. She tilts her chin up like a statue, eyes closed, as the liquid is dabbed over her face and throat, dripping occasionally into the collar of her gown. And then comes the strangest part, a final dusting of rice powder over her freshly cleaned skin. Not for beauty, but to absorb any night vapors that might creep in through the cold castle air, Because in Elizabeth's mind, the dangers of the night aren't just political, they're physical, creeping through the drafts to undo her carefully maintained facade. The powder is faint enough not to feel like makeup, but visible in the way it dulls the slight redness left behind from the cleansing. The chamber is quiet, except for the sound of cloth against skin, and the occasional soft clink of bowls being set aside. Outside, the wind combs through the bare branches in the courtyard, a steady, low hum against the stone walls. You notice how she keeps her eyes half open, watching the process in the mirror, but never quite meeting her own gaze. It's as if the woman looking back is someone she knows too well, and yet doesn't entirely trust. When it's all done, her skin looks neither young nor flawless, but somehow more human than you've ever imagined it. She leans back in the chair, a single candle still burning beside her, and waves the servants away. Alone now, she touches her face lightly, tracing the shape of her cheekbone with a fingertip, as though committing the texture to memory before tomorrow's mask must go back on. Somewhere in the dark corners of the room, the scent of vinegar and honey still hangs, stubborn and mingled, like a strange perfume only she could wear. The night presses in against the leaded windows, but for now, in this small circle of light, she's just a tired woman with clean skin, and the world beyond her door feels impossibly far away. The candle has burned low, its flame swaying in the gentle push of night air, sneaking in through some unseen crack in the wall. You let the last scenes of all these strange and stubborn habits drift through your mind, not in sharp focus now, but softened, as if each detail is wrapped in a faint mist. The vinegar scent, the honey stickiness, the rustle of layered skirts, the cold water poured from a silver jug, they all start to blend together into something less like history and more like a half-remembered dream. The people, those queens and empresses and ladies-in-waiting, seem to step back into shadow, their silhouettes melting into the fabric of centuries. Your breathing slows without you thinking about it, each inhale pulling in the quiet of the room, each exhale letting go of whatever little sharp edges your thoughts were still holding on to. The world you're lying in now feels softer, less urgent. The stone walls you imagined are just shapes in the dark. The flicker of torchlight is nothing more than the pulse of your own heartbeat, and even the drafty chill of the castle air has turned into something like the cool side of your pillow. The sounds fade, too. No more clinking bowls or muffled voices, just the steady, distant hum like a fan left running in the corner, or wind threading through old trees. You picture yourself turning away from the mirror, walking slowly down some torchlit hall, and then further, until the torches give way to moonlight, and the moonlight gives way to nothing but the warm darkness waiting for you. Everything you've seen tonight can stay there, in that quiet corner of your mind, like a cabinet you've closed for now. You don't need to open it again until you want to. Right here, right now, there's nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, and nothing pressing at your thoughts. Just the stillness, just the slow, drifting weight of sleep, curling up gently around you like a blanket you didn't realize was already there.